Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery Heritage Manager.
And my name's Olivia Howarth, and I'm a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it as far as Y. So we're getting pretty close. We're getting there. So my first Y is yawning. As is perhaps unsurprising, as we get towards the end of the alphabet, I have found it more and more challenging to find exciting words to explore. So my disclaimer at the start of this is, unfortunately, there's not a lot that's been written about yawning. So I'm going to go through what I have been able to find, but it hasn't really been a hot research topic at any point in history. So it's sort of little hints, little suggestions here and there, but not a huge amount. Let's get into yawning. So why do we yawn is a question which seems to have baffled physicians and scientists for a very long time. For some people, yawning was seen as a symptom. So at different periods in history, yawning has been seen as a symptom, an indication of pregnancy, an early sign of pregnancy, or an indication of epilepsy or gout, or perhaps that you had a fever coming on. These were all suggestions, none of which really seemed to have been proven, but these were some ideas. There were some myths around, especially women yawning during pregnancy and women yawning during childbirth and what that meant. So one version was that if a woman yawned while she was in the early stages of childbirth, that was a sign that this delivery would be especially difficult or especially problematic or dangerous. According to one of the Hippocratic texts, so that is a text either written by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates or more often by one of his followers, yawning was a sign that the body was overheating. So this is a quote, "Like the large quantities of steam that escape from cauldrons when water boils, the accumulated air in the body is violently expelled through the mouth when the body temperature rises." So again, it's that kind of getting the bad things out, which is such a recurring feature of that early medicine. The 16th century Italian physician Santorio, who we've definitely talked about in some episode, I assume either the stomach or the anus, because Santorio was the guy who built a weighing machine and then weighed himself, everything he ate and everything that he excreted. But he was very interested in sweating, and he was interested in, basically because the amount you excreted was smaller than the weight of the material that you ate, where did it go? Where did that extra sort of material go? And he was interested in how it was sweated out, or some of it was sweated out. He believed that sweating was a sign that the body was filled with perspiration, and that yawning was a mechanism that helped you to perspire. So yawning was almost the first indication that you were going to start sweating, was his theory. The 18th century Swiss physician Albrecht von Haller argued that we yawn in order to clear our lungs. So if our lungs are in some way unclean, yawning would clear them. The Dutch physician Herman Boerhaave thought that yawning increased blood flow and it stretched the muscles and it distributed the humours more evenly throughout the body. Again, coming back to that idea of humoral theory and these fluids moving around your body. So yes, he thought that yawning was one of the processes that made sure that humours didn't collect too much in one part of your body, that they moved around in a more healthy way. 18th century Scottish physician George Cheney thought that yawning was caused by bad vapors or by particles irritating the nerves. I don't quite know how that works. 18th century, they were very into nerves and had some very different definitions of what nerves were to what we think of them as being now. So George Cheney was very interested in melancholy and hysteria and those types of what were called nervous diseases. So yawning in his version was very tied into that. And actually, another big researcher on hysteria was the 19th century French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, and he also thought that yawning was a symptom of hysteria, so it was somehow tied in with the nerves. I found another French doctor who argued that yawning was a sign of limited intelligence, slow mind, weak character, laziness, depression, and being boring, which feels like quite a lot of baggage to put onto yawning. Finally, he also thought, quote, yawners were given to contemplating theft and fraud in their dealings. I feel like that's quite a heavy definition for just having a yawn. But even now, even in the 21st century, we don't have a full understanding of what yawning does. So sometimes it is connected to tiredness, but not always. And when you do yawn when you're tired, what does it achieve? Is it somehow stimulating for the body? One idea that people have posited is that it is about either increasing or reducing levels of oxygen, but there have been studies, so there was a big one in 1987, but there have been other ones as well, testing the hypothesis that yawning is about changing the oxygen level in your body, that it is a reflex action to improve oxygenation levels, and studies don't seem to bear that out. So even though that is an idea that people have suggested, we still don't fully know what yawning is all about. Historically, in some cultures, spirits were thought to enter the body through the mouth when a person yawned, and that's often why in many cultures you would cover your mouth, either with your hand or with something else when you yawned. It wasn't just a sort of general politeness, it was also this idea that there's literally you are exposing yourself in some way. During one bubonic plague outbreak around 590 AD, at a time of really massively heightened public fear, public superstition, the suggestion grew that yawning was fatal, that was how the plague was entering your body, was through yawning, or that something else dangerous or evil was entering your body. So people started making the sign of the cross over their mouths as they yawned. So rather than literally covering their mouths, it was protecting you from some evil in doing that. And that is really when, covering your mouth or putting something over your mouth becomes very commonplace. So yes, that covering your mouth when you yawn has a few purposes. It is literally protecting you from evil in this logic, but it is also probably handily helping to hide how hideously rotten and disgusting your teeth probably were. So that was another downside to yawning, was people didn't tend to have very nice teeth around 590 AD. So what's your why then, Olivia?
So I've gone for yellow fever. Yellow fever is an infectious viral disease transmitted by mosquitoes, primarily Aedes aegypti, and is typically of short duration. In most cases, symptoms include fever, chills, loss of appetite, nausea, muscle pains, and headaches. These symptoms typically improve within 5 days, but in about 15% of cases, the fever returns, causing abdominal pain and liver damage. The name yellow fever derives from the jaundice, yellowing of the skin and eyes, that some patients with the disease develop as a result of liver damage, a symptom that was a key characteristic of the disease. The virus is a member of the flavivirus genus, and the name flavus in Latin means yellow. Historically, yellow fever was also known as yellow jack because areas under quarantine and ships carrying the infection traditionally displayed a yellow flag. It was also referred to as black vomit because of the hemorrhagic bleeding in the stomach, which caused patients to vomit blood that looked like coffee grounds. As with other flavivirus infections, there's no known cure for yellow fever. Hospitalization is advisable and intensive care may be necessary. Symptomatic treatments include rehydration and pain relief with drugs like paracetamol. Although there is now an effective vaccine, the disease was a major threat in the past, causing epidemics, disrupting trade, and instigating big changes in the geopolitical landscape. So where did it start? Yellow fever is believed to have originated in sub-Saharan Africa. where it evolved alongside the mosquitoes that spread it, starting in East or Central regions before spreading towards West Africa. It's been suggested that as it was endemic, local populations may have developed acquired immunity to the disease. This would mean that when an outbreak occurred where colonists resided, most Europeans died, while indigenous African communities usually developed non-lethal symptoms resembling influenza. Although some researchers have argued that yellow fever might have existed in the Americas during the pre-Columbian period, because indigenous mosquitoes have been known to carry the disease, it's most likely that the virus and the mosquitoes that carried it were first introduced to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade in the 16th century. As European colonists and enslaved Africans spread across the Americas, yellow fever outbreaks became a regular occurrence, particularly in tropical regions and port cities. The earliest record of an epidemic in the New World that was likely yellow fever was in the Yucatan Peninsula in 1648. The indigenous Mayan people called the illness zekic, or blood vomit, and by the late 17th century, yellow fever had spread to major port cities such as New Orleans, Havana, and Philadelphia. In these areas, the disease became a major public health concern, causing periodic epidemics that led to significant mortality and social disruption. So now we know that caused by mosquitoes, but for centuries, the true cause of yellow fever remained a mystery. Early theories about its transmission were founded on the known transmission of other diseases or sometimes rooted in superstition. Prevailing theories about the spread of yellow fever included, no surprise, humoral theory. In the case of yellow fever, an excess of yellow bile was often thought to be the root cause of the disease, influencing both the appearance of jaundice and the severity of the symptoms. There was also contagion. It was believed that the disease was spread through direct contact with infected people, leading to some individuals being quarantined in an effort to stop the spread of the disease. Also, contaminated objects. The idea that yellow fever could be spread through contact with contaminated things like clothing, bedding, or other items used by infected individuals, and also airborne particles and rotting matter. Many attributed the disease to bad air or miasma emanating from rotting organic matter such as swamps or garbage, a common belief at the time that led to practices like burning tar in urban areas to purify the air. Treatments for yellow fever during this period were rudimentary and mostly ineffective. Bloodletting, purging, and other humoral treatments were common, and the focus was on balancing the body's humours rather than addressing the actual cause of the disease. But Dr. Benjamin Rush, who I don't think we can yet call a friend of a pod, but we have talked about him before, he claimed that he had discovered a cure for the disease. His treatment involved a program of intense bleeding and purging with calomel, otherwise known as mercurous chloride. Go and check out the episode on M. And jalap. His methods were described by some contemporaries as being more dangerous than yellow fever itself. And in particular, he had an ongoing feud with the English journalist, politician, and agriculturalist William Cobbett. So it's worth noting that Rush was publicizing his treatment during this famous outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia in 1783. It was the hottest summer on record. There was a blanket of humidity that covered the city that was fed by putrid swamps that served as breeding ground for the Aedes aegypti mosquito. And in a matter of months, 10% of Philadelphia's population was dead, and a greater proportion had sort of left the city in fear, which included major politicians of the time. And the fever outbreak was actually a contributing factor in moving the capital city away, Philadelphia not being the capital anymore. So the breakthrough in understanding yellow fever came in the late 19th century, thanks to the work of the Cuban physician Carlos J. Finley. In the 1880s, Finley proposed the revolutionary idea that mosquitoes, specifically the Aedes aegypti, were responsible for spreading yellow fever. His hypothesis was based on observations of the patterns of disease transmission in Havana, where yellow fever outbreaks were also common. But despite Finley's compelling theory, the medical community was slow to accept its findings. They were, however, taken up by Walter Reed, an American physician who eventually confirmed the mosquito connection. And in 1900, Reed and his team conducted a series of experiments in Cuba to test Finley's hypothesis. Reed's team exposed volunteers to mosquitoes that had fed on yellow fever patients, and it became clear that the mosquitoes were actually transmitting the virus. And that discovery obviously helped reshape the approach to controlling the disease. Another sort of significant period of history that involved yellow fever was the building of the Panama Canal. So in the early 20th century, the construction of the canal was plagued by yellow fever and malaria outbreaks, which claimed the lives of thousands of workers. And once Walter Reed's findings were widely accepted, the engineers and health officials implemented mosquito control measures like draining the standing water, fumigating areas, and using mosquito nets to protect the workers. And that intervention led to a dramatic reduction in the number of yellow fever and malaria cases among workers, which allowed the canal project to proceed. So a lot of people consider that the completion of the Panama Canal in 1914 was not just an engineering triumph, but also a public health victory, because it demonstrated the power of understanding disease transmission and implementing preventative measures.
So my second why is yogurt. And I'm not going to talk about modern day yogurt, but I would just like to say that I do find it strangely fascinating how Big Yogurt, or the yogurt marketing company, or whoever does yogurt, has managed to brand itself as simultaneously being a very indulgent dessert treat and also incredibly healthy and like a health food. And it can be both of those things at the same time, apparently. But I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to talk about the history of yogurt, and particularly the history of yogurt being used for medicinal purposes. So the earliest yogurt that we know about is somewhere around about 5,000 years ago in the region which is now Iraq. And it's about the time of the first domestication of milk-producing animals. So it's fairly quickly after goats and cows are domesticated that yogurt starts being produced. And as a result of that, countries which have, from those early days, domesticated animals like goats and cows, yogurt became a key part of the diet of these cultures very early on. And so for thousands of years, yogurt has been part of the diet in India, Turkey, Greece, Russia, many other places as well. The Roman author Pliny the Elder described how certain nomadic tribes would thicken their milk in order to make it something which you ate rather than drank. He didn't, unsurprisingly, use the word yogurt, but he was describing something very similar. Allegedly, and this is, as I say, this is allegedly rather than there's definitive proof, but allegedly Genghis Khan fed his Mongolian army yogurt because he believed that yogurt not only made you physically strong, but it also made you brave. Yogurt is introduced into Western Europe in the 1500s, and this is when the King of France at that time, Francis I, was suffering from diarrhea, and he was prescribed sheep yogurt by a doctor in Constantinople, now Istanbul. So the introduction of yogurt into Western Europe was as a medicine, as a treatment. And once yogurt took off in France and England and elsewhere in Europe, it began to be sold in pharmacies. So again, very, very focused on the medicinal uses rather than it just being something nice to eat. So from the outset, it was promoted as something that was good for the intestines, it was good for gut health, it was good for constipation. So in the same way that some of these products are marketed now, that was how they were marketed in the 1500s as well. Now get into my favourite example of historical medicinal use of yogurt, and that comes from John Harvey Kellogg. So he of Kellogg cereal fame. So just in case you're not familiar with Kellogg, beyond the cereal, which you almost certainly will be familiar with, Kellogg was raised and remained throughout his life a very devout Christian. He was also a qualified physician, and he was director of a sanitarium in Michigan. Now, we have to be careful with that word, because Kellogg himself coined the term sanitarium, and he specifically created it to sound a bit like sanatorium. Now, a sanatorium is where tuberculosis patients are treated. It has a very specific function. But that is not what sanitarium with an A was for. So he called it that to convey an idea of health and medicine. So because the word was so similar to a word which people already knew and understood, it felt like a medicinal place. But a sanitarium, as he defined it, was hospital-like, but not a hospital. It was supposed to convey the idea of somewhere that's sanitary and clean and health-giving, but without actually being a medical institution. So it was as much about clean minds and clean living as it was about anything to do with, genuine medicine. It was sort of a combination spa, hospital, and hotel in one. That's what a sanitarium was. And Kellogg's patients at this place included a number of famous names. It was a very successful institute and it brought in money as well. So they included the aviator, Amelia Earhart, the Nobel Prize winning playwright, George Bernard Shaw, the inventor, Thomas Edison, and Henry Ford. So this was not a small operation he was running. It was high profile and very desirable place to go for this sort of clean living experience. And it enforced, as far as you can enforce, vegetarianism, abstinence from smoking and alcohol, and sexual abstinence, including abstinence from masturbation, which, as I say, probably isn't the easiest thing to enforce. But it was all built around Kellogg's very personal vision of the body as a temple, clean living, all that sort of thing. And the food which was provided was very focused on, it's almost invalid food. Even though many, or possibly the majority of people staying there were not invalids, they were just there for a sort of health spa treatment. But the food was very much invalid food. So he didn't want people chewing too much. It had to be very, very bland, very tasteless. There was an idea that the more bland the food was, the more it would dull the passions, and in every sense, the passions in every sense. And Kellogg was very focused around digestion. And that's a big part of the reason for the Kellogg cereal, why he created that product. He thought that digestive problems or bad gut bacteria sort of poisoned the mind. So again, it's that very, I suppose holistic is the word, view. He thought that everything is so interconnected that if you are constipated, it will make you have sort of mental illness, really. And yogurt played a big part in all of this. It was a perfect example of the bland invalid food. It was supposed to be very good for digestion. It ticked all the boxes of what Kellogg was trying to achieve. All residents in his sanitarium were given 1 pint of yogurt a day, half a pint to be eaten, and half a pint to be administered rectally via an enema. So he's such a fan of medicinal yogurt, it's going in by all ends.
Oh, God. As soon as you said half a pint to be eaten, I knew that's where the other half was going.
It's so Kellogg. Everything I ever learn about Kellogg, you're like, oh my God, why are you doing this? So that's what I've got. That's all I've got. I just really wanted.
I knew there was an association between cereal and Kellogg and trying to dissuade people from masturbating, but I couldn't remember. You've elaborated enough that I now see the fuller picture of clean living and sanitary health.
Oh yeah, it was all part and parcel of the same thing. And I think sometimes in the sort of clickbait articles, sometimes the masturbation element is exaggerated. And it's like he invented cereal for that one purpose, which I don't think he did, but it was certainly part of his whole thing, it was alongside not smoking, not eating junk food, not drinking. So it wasn't like he was fixated on that one aspect, but it was definitely part of the story of what he was trying to achieve with this bland food. And obviously cereal, once it had been soaked in milk and all that sort of thing, it's all part of this sort of soft, bland food. And that was ultimately what it was all about. But it was a celebrity hotspot as well, though. People wanted this. It wasn't something that was being forced on people against their will. People really wanted to go and have a yogurt enema.
Was his the only sanitarium? Or did he sort of spark a bit of a...
There were copycats, certainly, but I think it is, and I actually think that I, for a while, did get those. It took me a while to realise that those were two different words that were different, totally different types of institutions. And obviously that's intentional. He's doing that intentionally. He is copying a word that has an existing meaning to kind of create a vibe. If he called it a hotel or something, it probably wouldn't have picked off in the same way, but it instantly had a credibility that it had sort of taken from these pre-existing sanatoriums because it was so similar. Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.